The dog didn't bark. That was the first thing anyone noticed. 43 trained working dogs stood in formation across the lawn of the Calgary Police Service Memorial Grounds, and not one of them made a sound. They had been positioned in their rows since 7 that morning, handlers at their sides, leashes taut, postures rigid. These were animals built for precision. Animals that had been through 400 hours of obedience training, scent tracking, crowd control, criminal apprehension. Animals that did not, under any circumstances, break formation during a public ceremony. Then the wind shifted. It came from the east, carrying the smell of cut grass and early September cold, the particular kind of Alberta morning that arrives like a warning. The ceremony was already underway. The deputy commissioner was mid-sentence at the podium, reading the names of officers and their canine partners lost in the line of duty over the past decade. Families sat in white folding chairs. Children held small Canadian flags. News cameras swept slowly across the crowd. Nobody was watching the far end of the memorial grounds, near the low stone wall, where the public entrance ran along the perimeter, nobody except the dogs. It started with the Malinois in the third row, a young male named Arrow, who had joined the Vancouver unit 14 months earlier. His nose lifted first, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Then his ears went flat against his skull, not in aggression, but in the way a dog moves when it hears something it cannot believe. Handler Corporal Paul Deschaines felt the leash go slack and looked down confused. Arrow wasn't pulling. He was trembling. Then the German shepherd beside him did the same thing. Then the next one. It moved through the formation like a current. 43 dogs. The handlers exchanged glances over the heads of their animals, uncertain whether to intervene or hold position. Sergeant Bryn Ellsworth, the senior handler coordinator for the RCMP's National K9 Division, stood at the edge of the formation and watched the ripple pass through her unit with an expression that could not quite settle on any one emotion. In 14 years working K9, she had never seen anything like it. "Hold your positions," she said quietly, into the radio clipped to her shoulder. "Do not release." But 3 rows back in the section designated for the Ontario Provincial Police Contingent, a 4-year-old German shepherd named Kodiak had already made up his mind. He simply sat down, not in protest, not in fear. He sat and faced the stone wall at the far end of the grounds, and he let out one sound, not a bark, not a whine, but something lower and longer and unmistakably human in its register. His handler, a tall man named Constable Ryan Beaupre, crouched beside him immediately and spoke his name. Kodiak did not look at him. He was looking at the woman standing just inside the public entrance. She hadn't done anything. She was standing still, actually, as though she herself couldn't quite decide whether to step forward or turn back. She was young, somewhere in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, hard to tell at a distance, wearing a plain grey jacket and dark trousers, the kind of clothes that asked to be overlooked. Her hair was pulled back. She held a single white chrysanthemum in both hands, the way people hold things when they don't know what else to do with them. She was looking at the dogs, and then Kodiak stood up, and the leash went from slack to nothing, because Constable Beaupre's hand simply opened. Later, he would not be able to explain why. He would try several times in the official report and in the conversations afterward, and each time he would stop at the same place and say, "I just couldn't hold him." Kodiak crossed the lawn at a run, and then, in what would later be described by every handler present as the single most disorienting moment of their professional careers, 6 more dogs followed him. 7 working K9s from 4 different law enforcement agencies across Canada, off-leash in a public ceremonial space, running full speed toward a stranger. The ceremony stopped. The deputy commissioner went silent mid-sentence. Cameras swung. Families stood. Children pressed close to their parents. 3 security officers moved immediately toward the woman at the wall, hands up, voices low and firm, asking her to identify herself, asking her not to move. She didn't move. She had gone completely still. the chrysanthemum pressed against her chest, watching the dogs come toward her with an expression that security officer Darren Kowalczyk would later describe in his incident report as appearing to recognize them. Kodiak reached her first. He simply put his head against her leg and made the same low sound he'd made from across the field, and stayed there. The 6 others arrived within seconds and arranged themselves around her in a loose half-circle, tails moving, some pressing their heads to her hands, one climbing partially into her lap as she sank slowly to her knees on the grass. Security had reached her by then. Kowalczyk stepped forward and asked again, "Ma'am, can you identify yourself?" She looked up at him. Her face was wet. "My name is Sloane Rutherford," she said. "I trained these dogs." The name meant nothing to most of the people present. To the handlers whose animals were currently refusing to leave her side, it meant slightly more, though none of them could have said exactly why, only that the name had a faint familiarity, the kind that belonged to something they'd read once and half forgotten. To Sergeant Bryn Ellsworth, who had moved quickly across the grounds, and now stood looking down at Sloane Rutherford kneeling on the memorial lawn, it meant something specific and complicated, and not entirely comfortable. She knew that name. She had seen it in a file she wasn't supposed to have opened. "Get me Colonel Fraser on the radio," she said quietly to the officer beside her. "Right now." What followed was not quick. It rarely is in situations where the official version of events collides with something that refuses to stay in its file. Sloane was escorted, gently, because the dogs made anything less than gentle feel inadvisable, to one of the green tents set up for dignitaries at the edge of the grounds. Someone brought her water. The dogs followed and settled around her feet, and not one handler in the group could persuade their animal to return to formation. Major Glenn Forsyth, who oversaw the RCMP's K9 operational program and had driven down from Ottawa specifically for this ceremony, arrived at the tent 11 minutes later, looking the way senior officials look when something has gone wrong in a very visible location. He stood in the entrance and looked at the 7 dogs. He looked at Sloane. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You weren't supposed to be here." "I know," Sloane said. "I came for the ceremony. I didn't plan for this to happen." Forsyth glanced at Bryn. Bryn gave him a look that meant, "I am not the one who needs to answer for this." He stepped inside the tent and let the flap fall shut behind him. What he said next, and what Sloane said in return, was not recorded officially. What came out afterward, in pieces, through the handlers who stood outside and heard fragments, through the public record that eventually surfaced, 3 months later, painted a picture that was less a scandal than a quiet, institutional wrong, the kind that happens when paperwork is more convenient than people. Sloane Rutherford was 29 years old. She had grown up on a small farm outside of Lacombe, Alberta, the kind of property that was more work than income, where her parents raised beef cattle and border collies, and where Sloane had spent her childhood learning animal behavior the way farm kids learn it. Not from textbooks, but from the animals themselves. She had come to working dogs sideways, the way most people find the things they are genuinely made for. At 22, she had been hired as a trainer's assistant at a facility in Red Deer that contracted with municipal police services across Alberta. Within 8 months, the head trainer had given her primary responsibility for the intake assessment program, the process by which newly acquired dogs were evaluated for service suitability. Within 2 years, she was running it. She had an aptitude that the people who worked with her described the same way regardless of whether they liked her or not. The dogs trusted her immediately. Not the nervous, temporary trust that most animals extend to handlers they're learning. Something more foundational than that. The kind of trust that, once given, did not withdraw. She had been 26 when she began working with what would become the cohort of animals at the memorial today. 12 of them had come from European breeders, German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois, from working bloodlines in Germany and the Netherlands. imported at considerable cost through a federal contract. The other 11 had been sourced domestically, rescue animals and dogs surrendered by breeders who couldn't place them, animals that had been assessed as unsuitable by other programs and passed to Sloane's facility as a last attempt. She had spent 18 months with those 23 dogs, 18 months of daily work, of learning each animal's particular language, its fears and its capacities, its specific way of communicating stress or willingness or confusion. She had named them all, which was against protocol, but which she had done anyway because names, she believed, were part of how animals understood their own identity. Kodiak had been one of the domestic rescues, a 2-year-old German shepherd surrendered by a family in Lethbridge who had acquired him as a puppy and found they couldn't manage him. He was not aggressive, he was intense and he was perceptive, and he had spent the first month at the facility refusing to engage with anyone except Sloane. By the end of 18 months, all 23 dogs had passed their service evaluations. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary outcome. Facilities that placed 60% of their intake considered that a success. Sloane had placed 100. Then the contract ended. Not because of anything she had done. The facility's funding agreement with the federal government was a fixed-term arrangement, and when it expired, the renewal negotiation collapsed over a dispute about liability clauses that had nothing to do with the animals or the trainers. The dogs were redistributed to partner agencies across the country. Sloane was offered a position at a different facility in British Columbia that she had turned down for reasons that were, on the surface, practical, and underneath something else entirely. She had not seen any of the dogs since. That had been 3 years ago. Bryn Ellsworth sat across from Sloane in the tent and listened to this, and the longer she listened, the more she understood the particular quality of the discomfort she had been carrying since she read the file. There had been a review, 18 months after the contract ended, an internal assessment of the K9 placement program that had, in the efficient and bloodless language of institutional process, raised questions about the training methodology used at the Red Deer facility. Not about the outcomes. The dogs were performing exceptionally, all of them, across every agency that had placed them. About the methodology, specifically about the degree of attachment the dogs had formed with their original trainer, and whether that attachment posed an operational risk. The review had been filed, nothing had come of it, formally, but informally, Sloane's name had been attached to a flag in the system, a soft flag, the kind that didn't prevent anything but ensured that certain doors stayed gently, inexplicably, perpetually closed. She had applied for positions with 2 federal agencies in the years since. Both times she had made it to the final interview stage. Both times she had received a letter that thanked her for her interest. The dogs remembered her. That was, in the language of the review, the problem. The dogs she had trained showed a measurably different response to her presence than to any other handler or trainer they encountered. Subsequently, it had been documented in one of the agency's, a note buried in a quarterly performance report, that Kodiak had shown elevated stress indicators during a handler transition exercise, and that the evaluating officer suspected a residual attachment pattern from early training. The language was clinical. The implication was clear. Sloane Rutherford had formed bonds with these animals that their subsequent training had not erased, and that was, in someone's assessment, a liability. It had never occurred to the people who wrote those assessments to consider that it might also be, in any meaningful sense, a testament. "How did you know about the ceremony?" Bryn asked. "It was public," Sloane said. "The RCMP posted it. You drove from Lacombe, yes, just to attend." Sloane looked at her. "I trained 23 dogs over 18 months. 7 of them are here today. I wanted to see them." Bryn was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the tent fabric, she could hear the ceremony resuming, the deputy commissioner's voice returning to the microphone, measured and deliberate. She could also hear, beneath it, the sound of multiple large dogs settling on grass, and the low, occasional sounds they made to each other and to the woman beside them. "The flag in your file," Bryn said. It was not quite a question. "I know about it. It's not formal. It doesn't prevent you from being hired by any federal agency I've applied to in 3 years," Sloane said. Not with bitterness exactly, with the flatness of someone who has had enough time to move through bitterness to something more durable. "No, it's not formal." Bryn looked at the dogs. Kodiak had his head on Sloane's knee. The others were distributed around her in the loose, deliberate arrangement of animals that have decided a location is safe. A 4-year-old Malinois named, according to his vest tag, Fork, had stretched out fully on the grass with his chin resting on Sloane's boot. He was breathing slowly, the way dogs breathe when they are more comfortable than they have been in some time. "These are the best-performing animals in the national program," Bryn said. "I know." Fork qualified highest in his cohort at the RCMP training center, by a significant margin. He was one of the domestic rescues, Sloane said. "He came to me from a hoarding situation in Camrose. He couldn't be touched for the first 3 weeks. He used to hide under the equipment shed." She paused. "He's always liked having something solid under his chin." Bryn looked at Fork. Fork did not look at Bryn. She picked up her radio. Colonel Andrew Fraser arrived at the tent 25 minutes later. He was a compact, grey-haired man who had spent 31 years in the RCMP and who had, in that time, developed the capacity to walk into difficult situations and make them feel, at least initially, like something that could be solved through process. He looked at Sloane. He looked at the dogs. He sat down in one of the folding chairs and rested his hands on his knees. "Tell me about the 23. He said, so Sloane told him. She started with Kodiak and the hoarding situation in Camrose, and she moved through all 7 animals that were present, their names, their histories before they came to her, the specific work she had done with each one, what they had been afraid of, and what they had learned, and what they had turned into. She was precise, and she was specific, and she did not editorialize. She spoke about the dogs the way she might have spoken about students, not with sentimentality, but with the particular regard of someone who had paid close attention for a long time. Fraser listened, without interrupting. When she finished, "The other 16, do you know where they are?" Sloane did. She had kept track, quietly, through public agency reports, and the occasional post in the professional circles she still moved in. She knew that 3 were with the Ontario Provincial Police, 2 with the Vancouver Police Department, 4 with various municipal services in Alberta, 3 with the RCMP's Pacific Division, and 4, the 4 she thought about most, with a Border Services unit in Manitoba. "All 23 are still in service," she said. "All of them are performing." Fraser nodded slowly. He looked at Bryn. He looked at Major Forsyth, who had been standing near the entrance of the tent for the past several minutes saying nothing. Something passed between the 3 of them. Not words, but the particular silence of people in institutional positions who are realizing that a small, quiet injustice has become quite suddenly very visible. Outside, the ceremony was concluding. The Deputy Commissioner was reading the final names. A piper had begun. "The flag needs to come out of your file," Fraser said finally. Forsyth shifted his weight. "Andrew, the review process would require—" "I'm not asking about the review process," Fraser said, without raising his voice. "I'm telling you what needs to happen." He looked at Sloane. "I apologize that it took this." Sloane looked down at Kodiak's head on her knee. She put her hand on it. "I just wanted to see them," she said again. The piper was still playing when they came out of the tent. The ceremony had officially ended, but the crowd had not dispersed. They were gathered in loose groups across the memorial grounds, and many of them had turned to watch as the 7 dogs rose and followed Sloane back out into the open. Word had moved through the crowd the way word always moves, imprecisely and quickly, and people had a general, approximate understanding that something significant was happening, even if they could not have said exactly what. The families of the officers honored that day were still present. Some of them had moved toward the stone wall where the dogs' names were engraved, running fingers over the letters. A woman in her 60s with a veteran's pin on her lapel stood very still near the edge of the formation area, watching Sloane with an expression that was impossible to read from a distance. Sloane stopped in the middle of the lawn. She looked at the 7 dogs around her, at Kodiak, who had not left her side since he crossed the field, at Falk, who walked with the particular lightness of an animal that has been carrying something it has let down, at the 5 others, each one known to her by name and history and the particular way they held their shoulders when they were uncertain, each one wearing a vest that named their current unit, their current handler, their current designation, each one exactly what she had believed they could be on the day they arrived at a facility in Red Deer as frightened or difficult or damaged animals who had not yet become themselves. She crouched down. Kodiak came immediately and pressed his forehead to hers. It was not a command response. It was not trained behavior. It was simply what he did, and what he had always done since the 3rd week at the facility when he had crossed the kennel floor for the first time and stood in front of her and waited to see if she was someone who would disappoint him. She had not disappointed him. One by one, the others came close. Sloane moved through them, her hands on Falk's broad head, on the younger Malinois, who had been a 2-kilogram puppy in a breeding facility in Abbotsford when she had selected him, on the shepherd from the Netherlands, who had arrived crate-trained and brilliant, and so overstimulated by everything that his first evaluation had nearly washed him out. She knew each of them the way you know something you have worked very hard for. Not perfectly, not without the rough edges that time and distance leave on any relationship, but thoroughly. The crowd watched. The cameras that had been sweeping the ceremony now held still. Constable Ryan Beaupre stood at the edge of the formation area with Kodiak's empty leash in his hand, and later he would say that the thing that stayed with him was not the drama of the dogs are raking ranks or the tent meeting, or any of what came after. It was the way Sloane moved through those 7 animals, methodical and quiet and completely without performance, as though the crowd did not exist, as though the cameras did not exist, as though there was nothing in the world at that moment except the 7 dogs, and whatever it was that she and they had once built together. She wasn't showing us anything, he told his partner that evening. She was just with them, that's all. 3 months after the memorial ceremony in Calgary, the federal flag was formally removed from Sloane Rutherford's file. The review that followed was brief and, in the end, not particularly complicated. The performance records of the 23 dogs trained at the Red Deer facility were assessed against national benchmarks. The assessors used phrases like exceptional foundational conditioning and unusually robust stress tolerance profiles, and above-average bonding stability across handler transitions. What they meant, in language the reports did not quite use, was that the dogs were good at their work because someone had understood them first. Sloane accepted a position with the RCMP and assessment program the following January. She was based out of Innisfail, Alberta, 45 minutes from the farm where she had grown up, close enough to drive home for Sundays. The position was new. It had been created specifically to address what the internal assessment called gaps in early-stage attachment methodology, which was, as Sloane understood it, the institutional way of acknowledging that the way she worked with dogs was worth preserving. She did not say this out loud because she was not the kind of person who needed to. She brought in the first new cohort of dogs in March, 14 of them, 6 from European breeders, 8 domestic rescues and surrenders ranging from 18 months to 3 years old. 3 of them had been flagged as unsuitable by previous programs. She named them all. The first one she evaluated was a 2-year-old German shepherd from a shelter in Winnipeg. He had been returned twice by previous adopters, both times for what the shelter notes called failure to bond. He had been in the shelter system for 14 months. His file listed his temperament as withdrawn, unresponsive to standard engagement protocols. Sloane sat in the assessment kennel with him for 40 minutes without speaking. She did not offer treats. She did not extend her hand. She simply occupied the same space he did and waited. On the 41st minute, he walked across the kennel and sat down in front of her. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "Hi, I'm going to take assessment file, high potential. Needs time. Recommend full program." She gave him a name. She called him Chance.